I have observed in the long years during which I have had the honor of sharing rooms with Sherlock Holmes in Baker Street, that crime often announces itself in London not with violence but with silence. There's a peculiar hush that precedes certain Casusus stillness that seems to settle upon the city like a damp cloth laid over a fevered brow. It was upon such an evening, heavy with fog and the smell of coal smoke drifting sluggishly through the gaslit streets, that our first intimation of the affair, known later as the candle that went out alone, reached us. Holmes had been in one of his moods of deep abstraction, lounging in his armchair with his long fingers steepled together, and his gaze fixed upon the ceiling as though it contained some cipher only he could decipher. A violin lay untouched upon the table beside him, and the room bore that air of expectant quiet which I had learned, over time, to associate with the approach of intellectual thunder. I was seated nearby, attempting to compile notes on a case we had recently concluded, when the sound of hurried footsteps echoed upon the stair. Mrs. Hudson's voice followed almost immediately, slightly breathless. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it is urgent. Most urgent indeed." Holmes did not move. "Show him in," he said simply. The door opened, and a man entered whose appearance immediately struck me as one of extreme agitation restrained only by effort of will. He was of middle height, dressed in a dark overcoat that bore the damp stains of the night fog, and his hat was clutched tightly in both hands. But it was not his clothing that drew my attention, it was his face, pale, drawn, and marked by an expression of a man who has seen something he cannot reconcile with reason. He took a few steps into the room, then hesitated, as though uncertain whether even Baker Street could offer him refuge. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "And you are in distress," Holmes replied calmly, "not of recent origin, but of precisely 36 hours' duration. You have not slept in that time, and you have travelled here directly from a place where something occurred that you cannot explain." The man staggered back a step. How can you know that?" Holmes made a small gesture toward the man's coat. "The edge of your sleeve bears the faint imprint of wax, and yet not the yellow wax of cheap candles, but the pale ivory wax used in households of some refinement. There is also a faint scorch mark upon your cuff, suggesting proximity to flame, though not direct contact. You have travelled from a residence, not an inn, for no man in lodgings would carry a candle of such quality in his own possession. As to your sleeplessness, it is written in the dilation of your eyes and the tremor of your left hand." The man sank into the nearest chair as though his strength had suddenly abandoned him. "My name is Edwin Mallory," he said at last. "I am clerk to the solicitor firm of Harridge and Company, and I come to you because I fear I am either losing my mind or that something in this world is not as it should be." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "In what manner?" Mr. Mallory swallowed hard. "I witnessed a death," he said. "A man died in a locked room. There was no weapon, no sign of struggle. And yet the only candle in the room went out at the exact moment of his death. It did not flicker. It did not sputter. It simply went out, as though it had obeyed a command. There was a pause. Even I, who had seen Holmes confront matters of the most extraordinary nature, felt a faint unease creep upon me at the phrasing. Holmes, however, showed no surprise. He merely regarded our visitor with a steady, almost clinical interest. "Continue," he said. Mr. Mallory nodded shakily. "It occurred at the house of Lord Pembroke in Kensington. A private meeting had been arranged, only 5 gentlemen present, all men of standing. The purpose was legal, I believe, though I was not privy to all details. I was there only as a clerk, to witness documents." "And the deceased?" Holmes asked. "Sir Reginald Crowther," Mallory replied. "A financier. A man not universally liked, but respected for his influence." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "And the room was locked from within?" "Yes." "The door had a bolt. When it was forced open, Sir Reginald was found seated at the table, upright, as though merely asleep, but he was dead. The candle beside him, extinguished." Holmes rose suddenly and crossed to the mantelpiece, where he stood for a moment in silence. "And what," he asked without turning, "did the others in the room do upon discovering this?" "They shouted. They called for doctors. Some claimed it was poison, others a seizure. But I saw something else." Holmes turned slightly. "Yes?" "The flame went out before he died," Mallory whispered. A silence settled upon the room. Even Mrs. Hudson, passing briefly in the hallway outside, seemed to tread more softly. Holmes returned to his chair with deliberate calm. "Mr. Mallory," he said at last, "you are either the sole reliable witness to a phenomenon of considerable scientific interest, or you are mistaken in your sequence of events." "I am not mistaken," Mallory insisted. "I remember it clearly." The candle did not fail. It obeyed. At this Holmes's lips curled faintly, not in amusement, but in contemplation. "A candle," he murmured, "does not obey. It burns, or it does not burn, depending upon oxygen, wick condition, and external interference." He leaned forward. "Unless, of course," he added quietly, "someone extinguished it." Mallory shook his head violently. "There was no movement, no one near it." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "That," he said, "is precisely why I shall take the case." Later that evening, after our visitor had been settled with tea and assurances which did little to restore his composure, Holmes paced the length of the room in that rapid, energetic manner I had come to recognize as the prelude to action. "Watson," he said abruptly. "Yes, Holmes?" "Pack lightly. We leave for Kensington within the hour." "You believe there is more to this than a death?" I asked. Holmes paused. "I believe," he said, "that a man has died in circumstances that defy the simplest rules of observation. And whenever that occurs, Watson, it is not nature that has erred, it is perception." He picked up his coat and threw it over his shoulders. "And I am rarely mistaken in matters of perception." Outside, the fog had thickened into a dense grey veil through which the gas lamps burned like dim, suspended suns. As we stepped into the waiting cab, I could not help but reflect upon the singular phrase our visitor had used. The candle went out alone. It was, I confess, the first time in many years that I felt the faint, uncomfortable suspicion that we were about to encounter something that would not yield easily to reason. Holmes, however, merely tapped the roof of the cab with his cane. "To Kensington," he called. And so began our acquaintance with a case that would, in time, test even his extraordinary intellect in ways I had never before witnessed. It is a curious truth that Sherlock Holmes, for all his disdain of official Scotland Yard procedure, possessed a singular talent for reducing the most complex matters to their most elementary form by the simple act of observing something everyone else had chosen to ignore. I had seen him do it countless times, and yet I confess that I never ceased to feel a certain quiet admiration at the ease with which he dismantled the pretensions of others. On the morning following Mr. Mallory's visit, Holmes was in unusually brisk spirits. The fog of the previous night had lifted somewhat, leaving London in that peculiar state of washed greyness that resembles neither clear day nor true mist. The streets of Kensington, however, still bore the damp residue of the night, and the stones glistened faintly beneath the passing wheels of cabs. We arrived at Lord Pembroke's residence shortly after 10 o'clock. It was a house of considerable stature, set back from the road behind iron gates and a small but well-kept garden. A constable stood watch outside, and upon recognizing Holmes he stepped aside without question a small testament, I have often thought, to the reputation Holmes had already established among the police. Inside we were received by Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, whose expression bore the familiar mixture of irritation and reluctant respect that I had come to associate with his dealings with my friend. "Holmes," he said shortly, "I should have known you'd turn up. I suppose you've come to tell us what we've missed." "I have come," Holmes replied calmly, "to see what you have seen." Lestrade gave a dry laugh. "You'll find nothing extraordinary here, I assure you. Man drops dead in a locked room, heart failure most likely. We've had the doctor in already." Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he glanced past Lestrade toward the interior of the house. "And the candle?" he asked quietly. Lestrade hesitated. "What candle?" "The one Mr. Mallory mentioned," I added. "Oh, that!" Lestrade said dismissively. "Yes, there was a candle. Snuffed out when we arrived. Draught in the room, likely. Nothing mysterious about it." Holmes's eyes flickered briefly toward me. Then he stepped forward. "May I see the room?" Lestrade shrugged. "Be my guest, though I warn you there's nothing to see." The room in question was situated on the upper floor, a spacious study with tall windows overlooking the garden. Even in daylight there lingered about it a certain heaviness, as though the air itself had not yet recovered from whatever had transpired within it. At the center stood a long mahogany table. Upon it lay scattered documents, inkstand, and the faint outline of where a body had been removed. The chair at its head remained slightly askew. Holmes did not speak for several minutes. He walked slowly around the table, his eyes taking in every inch of surface, every irregularity of arrangement. I followed, though I quickly realized that what appeared to me as disorder was, to him, a language. At last he stopped. "Interesting," he murmured. Lestrade folded his arms. "I knew you'd say that. You always do." Holmes ignored him. "Watson," he said, "observe the candle." It stood at the right-hand corner of the table, a simple wax taper in a brass holder. Nothing about it appeared unusual. "What of it?" I asked. "Notice the wax," Holmes replied. I bent closer. The wax had indeed dripped, but in a manner that suggested the candle had burned for some time before being extinguished. "It has been used," I said. "Precisely," Holmes said. "And yet Mr. Mallory insists it went out at the moment of death." Lestrade gave a short snort. People confuse timing all the time under stress. Holmes turned to him. "Inspector, may I ask, was this candle examined before the body was removed?" Lestrade hesitated. "Why would it be?" Holmes's expression remained neutral, but I detected a faint tightening around his eyes. "Because," he said, "the position of the wax indicates it was extinguished deliberately and not suddenly." He leaned slightly over the table. A sudden extinguishing such as by a gust of air would produce uneven wax pooling and an irregular wick collapse. This candle, however, shows a clean interruption of burn. The flame was not disturbed. It was terminated. Lestrade frowned. "Terminated?" "It's a candle, Holmes, not a criminal." Holmes did not smile. "Everything that ceases to function without obvious cause invites investigation." He straightened and walked slowly toward the window. "The room was locked from within," he said. "Correct?" "Yes," Lestrade replied. "And the door forced only after the alarm was raised?" Holmes tapped the window frame lightly with his knuckle. "And no other means of entry?" "None." Holmes paused for a long moment, then spoke quietly. "Then either the laws of physics were suspended in this room for a brief interval, or someone has been rather careless in their observation." Lestrade gave a dismissive wave. "You'll be telling me next the candle killed him." At that Holmes turned sharply. "No," he said. "But I would very much like to know why it was extinguished before anyone entered the room." We spent the next hour examining the study in detail. Holmes moved with his usual precision, inspecting not only the obvious points of interest but also the insignificant scratches beneath the table edge, the dust pattern near the window latch, even the spacing of footprints upon the carpet. It was during this examination that he made a discovery which, though small in appearance, caused him to pause for an unusually long time. "Watson," he said at last. "Yes?" "Look here." He pointed to the edge of the table. There, almost invisible unless viewed at a precise angle, was a faint smear of soot. I bent closer. "It appears to be candle residue," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied softly, "but notice its direction." I followed the smear. It did not trail randomly, nor did it appear spread by contact. It suggested movement purposeful, almost deliberate. Holmes stood very still. "A candle," he said, almost to himself, "does not move its own smoke." Lestrade, overhearing, gave an impatient sigh. "You're reading too much into nothing, Holmes." But Holmes did not respond. Instead he turned to me. "Watson," he said quietly, "Mr. Mallory said the candle went out at the moment of death. And yet this smear suggests the flame was moved shortly before extinction." I nodded slowly. "Which would imply that someone was close enough to extinguish it," Holmes finished. He paused. "And yet Mr. Mallory insists no one moved." A silence settled over us. Holmes walked slowly back to the center of the room. "Inspector Lestrade," he said at last, "may I ask who was seated closest to the candle?" Lestrade consulted his notes. Sir Reginald Crowther himself. It was his place at the table. Holmes nodded slowly. "And the others?" Lestrade named them. Lord Pembroke, Sir Alden Grey, Mr. Mallory, and 2 legal associates. Holmes listened without interruption. Then, quietly, he said, "One of them is lying." Lestrade gave a short laugh. "Which one?" Holmes turned slightly toward him. "That," he said, "is the only question worth answering." And with that he resumed his examination of the room, though I could tell by the set of his shoulders that his thoughts had already moved beyond what any of us yet understood. Outside the daylight dimmed as another bank of fog began to gather over Kensington, and I found myself reflecting upon the strange certainty with which Holmes had spoken. Not if someone was lying, but which one? And somewhere in that locked room where a candle had gone out without explanation, I began to feel that we were standing at the edge of something far more deliberate and far more unsettling than a simple death. There are moments in the course of an investigation when the mind, however trained it may be, begins to resist the evidence of the senses, not because the facts are unclear, but because they are too precise, as though reality itself has been arranged with an unnatural intention. It was upon such a moment that we found ourselves as Holmes continued his examination of the room in Lord Pembroke's house. The Inspector Lestrade had withdrawn to the doorway, clearly impatient with Holmes's meticulous scrutiny. I, however, remained close, for I had long learned that even the smallest observation in Holmes's presence might later reveal itself to be of critical importance. Holmes had now turned his attention away from the table and was examining the fireplace. It was an ornate structure of polished stone, unused on this particular morning, though faint traces of ash indicated it had been recently cleaned. "Watson," he said without looking up. "Yes, Holmes? Do you notice anything peculiar about the ash?" I stepped forward and peered into the grate. At first glance there was nothing remarkable, only a light scattering of grey residue. "I see nothing unusual," I admitted. "Precisely," Holmes said. "That is the problem." He knelt beside the fireplace with a fluid motion, producing from his pocket a small magnifying lens. Through it he studied the ash with great care. Lestrade gave an audible sigh. "Really, Holmes, I fail to see what you expect to find in a cold fireplace." Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he extended a gloved finger and gently touched a portion of the ash near the rear of the grate. "Watson," he said softly, "what do you expect ash to do when disturbed?" "To scatter," I replied. "Indeed," he said, "and yet observe." He withdrew his finger. The ash did not scatter. It shifted slightly, but in a compacted form, as though it had been pressed rather than simply deposited. I frowned. "That is unusual," I admitted. Holmes rose slowly. "It is more than unusual," he said. "It is deliberate." Lestrade stepped forward. "Deliberate? You're suggesting someone arranged fireplace ash?" Holmes turned toward him. "I am suggesting," he said calmly, "that someone wished it to appear undisturbed while ensuring it was not." There was a pause. Even Lestrade seemed momentarily uncertain how to respond to this. Holmes continued. "A fireplace is a convenient place to dispose of burnt material, Inspector. Yet here we find ash that has been handled in a manner inconsistent with casual disposal. It has been pressed, compacted, and most interestingly left in a state that suggests concealment rather than use." I looked again more carefully. "Concealment of what?" I asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "That," he said, "is precisely what we must determine." We left the study shortly afterward and made our way downstairs, where Holmes requested to speak once more with the household staff. Lestrade, clearly eager to be rid of what he considered unnecessary complications, arranged for the servants to be assembled in the lower hall. It was here that we first observed the individuals involved in this peculiar affair. There was Lord Pembroke himself, a tall man of aristocratic bearing, whose composed exterior suggested either innocence or exceptional self-control. Beside him stood Sir Alden Grey, a lawyer of severe expression and sharp eyes. Mr. Mallory, pale and visibly shaken, avoided eye contact with everyone. Two other gentlemen, both legal associates, stood somewhat apart, speaking in hushed tones. Holmes observed them all in silence for several moments before stepping forward. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I should like to ask a simple question." There was a brief pause. "Did anyone in that room touch the candle after Sir Reginald Crowther died?" The question seemed to hang in the air longer than expected. Lord Pembroke spoke first. "Certainly not. There was no reason to—" Sir Alden. Grey shook his head. "No one approached the candle." The shock of the moment. But Holmes raised a hand slightly. "I am not asking whether it was necessary," he said. "I am asking whether it occurred." Another silence followed. Mr. Mallory swallowed visibly. I did not touch it," he said quickly. "I did not go near it." Holmes's gaze shifted to him. "You are certain?" "Yes," Mallory insisted. "I swear it." Holmes regarded him for a moment longer than was comfortable, then turned away. "Very well," he said, but I noticed something in his expression, a faint tightening around the eyes that suggested he had not accepted the answer at all. Later, once we had withdrawn to a separate drawing-room at Lestrade's insistence, Holmes stood by the window in silence for several minutes. The fog outside had thickened again, turning the street beyond into a blurred abstraction of movement and shadow. "You do not believe them," I said at last. Holmes did not turn. "I believe," he said, "that each of them has told the truth as they understand it." "That sounds like belief," I remarked. "No," Holmes replied quietly. "It is simply a recognition that perception is not equivalent to reality." He turned slightly then, his expression thoughtful. "Watson, what do you recall of the candle?" That it was extinguished at the time of death, I replied. And do you remember seeing it extinguished? I hesitated. No, I admitted. Only Mr. Mallory's account. Holmes nodded. Exactly. He walked slowly back toward the center of the room. We are dealing with a situation in which no independent witness confirms the most crucial event, he said, and yet everyone agrees upon its significance. That suggests coordination, I said slowly. Or suggestion, Holmes corrected. He paused. Watson, have you ever observed how easily a memory can be influenced by a narrative delivered with sufficient confidence? I considered this. Yes, I said cautiously. Then you will understand, Holmes said, why I place very little value on testimony in isolation. He moved to a small side table where a tray had been left. Upon it lay a half-burned candle, presumably taken from the study. Holmes picked it up. This is our only physical witness, he said. I leaned closer. It appeared ordinary. Holmes examined the wick carefully. And yet, he continued softly, it raises a question Mr. Mallory did not anticipate. What question? I asked. Holmes looked at me directly. If the candle went out at the moment of death, why is its burn pattern inconsistent with sudden extinction? There was a pause. I frowned. You believe the timing is incorrect? Holmes turned back toward the mirror. And what did this Dr. Grange do with mirrors? Linwood shook his head. I don't know. The agent said he was eccentric, obsessed with optics and light. He modified the house before his disappearance. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. Disappearance, he said. An interesting choice of word. He stepped closer to the mirror again. This time he did not raise his hand. He simply looked at it, and the reflection looked back. A long moment passed. Then Holmes spoke very softly. Dr. Grange is still here. Linwood blinked. Here? In this house? Holmes shook his head. No, he said. Not in the way you mean. He turned away from the mirror. In every structured system, Holmes continued, there is always a controlling intelligence, a mind that determines the rules by which the system behaves. He paused. This house is not random. It is constructed. And if it is constructed, then someone understood precisely what they were building. I felt a slight unease at his words. Holmes, I said, are you suggesting that Grange designed this? Holmes glanced at me briefly. I am suggesting, he replied, that he understood mirrors in a way most men do not. Linwood suddenly stepped forward. Then he is responsible for this madness, he exclaimed. He must be found, arrested. I am the victim here. Holmes regarded him with a calm, almost distant expression. Possibly, he said. The lack of certainty in that single word unsettled me more than any accusation. Holmes moved toward the door. We are leaving this room, he said. Linwood blinked. Leaving? But what about my reflection? Holmes stopped. He turned slightly. You assume, he said, that your reflection belongs to you. A silence followed. Then we returned to the corridor. The hallway seemed darker than before, or perhaps it was simply that our awareness of it had changed. The mirrors lining the walls no longer felt like passive objects. They felt attentive, waiting. Holmes walked ahead, his movements steady, controlled. Linwood followed closely behind me, as though afraid that distance from Holmes might increase his vulnerability. At the base of the staircase, Holmes paused. Watson, he said, what is your impression of Mr. Linwood? I blinked. In what sense? Medical, he replied. Psychological. Behavioral. I hesitated. He appears distressed, possibly suffering from hallucinations induced by stress or environmental suggestion. Holmes nodded. A reasonable conclusion, he said. Then he added quietly, and incorrect. Linwood stiffened. I am not imagining this. Holmes raised a hand slightly. I did not say you were, he said calmly. I said your interpretation of it may be incomplete. He began ascending the stairs again. We returned to the drawing room, but something had changed. The mirrors no longer reflected the room as they had before. Or rather than they did, but imperfectly. There was a subtle mismatch, angles that did not align, movements that lagged by fractions of a second. It was as though the entire room was slowly losing synchronization with its own image. Holmes stood in the center and looked around. Yes, he said quietly. It is spreading. Linwood's voice cracked. What is spreading? Holmes turned to him. The separation. I felt a tightening in my chest. Holmes, separation of what? Holmes looked at me then, and for a moment his expression softened not with emotion, but with clarity. Between object and representation, he said. Between person and reflection. He gestured toward the mirrors. This system does not merely capture images. It decouples them. Linwood stepped back. That's absurd. Is it? Holmes replied. Then why does your reflection hesitate? Why does mine no longer obey me in that bathroom mirror?" He paused. "And more importantly, why you still hold?" That last sentence struck the room like a bell. Linwood froze. "What do you mean?" he whispered. Holmes stepped closer to him. "I mean," he said, "that if the process were complete, you would not be standing here as a unified individual. A pause. You would already be divided." A heavy silence fell. Then, from somewhere in the house below, we heard a sound, a faint crack, like glass. Holmes turned immediately toward the sound, and for the first time since arriving his expression shifted. Not fear, but anticipation. "Watson," he said quietly, "we are no longer dealing with a passive anomaly." He began walking toward the stairs again. "We are dealing with a system that has begun to respond." Linwood followed quickly. "Respond to what?" Holmes did not look back. "To us," he said. And as we descended once more into the mirror-lined corridors of Kensington, I could not shake the growing certainty that the house was no longer merely observing us. It was beginning to decide things about us. The sound we had heard, the faint crack of glass adjusting itself, lingered in my mind as we descended once more into the lower floor of the house. It was not loud nor violent, yet it possessed a quality that made it impossible to ignore. I have often observed that certain sounds do not merely reach the ear, they settle in the memory, as though they had always belonged there. Edward Linwood remained close behind me. His breathing had grown uneven, and I noticed that he kept glancing at the mirrors along the staircase, as though expecting one of them to change its mind and step out into the corridor. Holmes, however, moved with increasing purpose. We returned to the drawing-room, where the mirrors still lined the walls in their silent, watchful arrangement. Yet something had changed in the brief time we were gone. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable once noticed. The reflections were no longer merely delayed. They were inconsistent. A hand lifted in one mirror might appear slightly higher in another. A step forward might register at different moments across different surfaces. It was as though the room had become fragmented into multiple versions of the same instant, each one slightly out of alignment with the others. Holmes stopped in the center of the room. "Watson," he said quietly, "observe the mirror on the far left." I did so. At first I saw nothing unusual. Holmes stood reflected in it as expected. But then I noticed something troubling. In that mirror Holmes blinked. In the room itself he did not. A cold sensation passed through me. "Holmes," I said, lowering my voice, "your reflection." "Yes," he replied calmly. "It is no longer strictly dependent on me." Linwood let out a sharp breath. "This is impossible. Reflections don't act independently." Holmes turned slightly toward him. "Then you have not studied optics deeply enough," he said. "Or perhaps you have studied them too casually." He approached the nearest mirror and examined it with intense focus. "What is happening," Holmes continued, "is not rebellion. It is separation refinement." I frowned. "Raffinement?" Holmes nodded. "The system is learning how to isolate representation from origin with increasing precision. At first, delay, then désynchronisation. Now, partial autonomy." He stepped back. "And that means someone intended it to evolve." A silence followed. Linwood spoke hesitantly. "But why would anyone want that? What purpose could there be in separating a man from his reflection?" Holmes looked at him directly. "That," he said, "is the correct question at last." He turned and began walking slowly around the room again, studying each mirror as though reading a text written in glass. "Every scientific apparatus," Holmes continued, "requires an objective. Not all objectives are benign." He stopped beside a tall mirror and tapped its frame. "This installation is not experimental in the casual sense. It is structured, repeatable." He paused. "And therefore, it has a function." I stepped closer. What function could this possibly serve? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he asked a question of his own. "Watson, have you ever studied the psychology of identity distortion?" I hesitated. "Only in passing." "Then consider this," he said. "What remains of a man if his image can be removed without his knowledge?" A chill ran through me. Holmes continued. "A reflection is not merely visual. It is psychological confirmation. The mind relies on it as proof of continuity. Remove it, and the mind begins to doubt itself." He gestured toward Linwood. "Mr. Linwood is not merely afraid because he believes he has lost his reflection. He is afraid because something within him has already begun to question whether he ever had one to begin with." Linwood shook his head violently. "That is not true." Holmes raised a hand slightly. "I am not accusing you," he said evenly. I am describing the effect." He turned back to the mirrors. "And now we must find the cause." We began a more thorough examination of the room. Holmes instructed Linwood and myself to observe specific mirrors while he moved between them, noting inconsistencies. What followed was one of the most unusual investigative procedures I have ever witnessed. Holmes would stand before one mirror and perform a simple action, raising his hand, turning his head, stepping forward while we recorded the behavior of his reflections in others. The results were increasingly disturbing. In one mirror his reflection anticipated movement, in another it lagged behind. In a third it hesitated entirely, as though uncertain whether Holmes still existed. At one point Holmes stood perfectly still for a full minute. In that minute I observed something that I will not easily forget. One of the reflections moved without him, not dramatically, not theatrically, simply a slight shift of posture, as though it were becoming accustomed to independence. Linwood whispered hoarsely, "This cannot continue." Holmes ignored him. Instead, he crouched near the base of one mirror and examined something on the floor. After a moment, he reached out and picked up a small object, a thin metal fitting, almost like a hinge fragment. He studied it carefully. Then his eyes narrowed. "Watson," he said, "come here." I approached. He held the fragment up. "This is not decorative," he said. "It is structural." Linwood stepped closer. "Structural? For what?" Holmes stood. "For repositioning." He walked to the center of the room. "These mirrors are not fixed installations," he said. "They can be adjusted, realigned." He looked upward slightly, as though visualizing the geometry of the room. "And when you alter the angles of reflective surfaces in a closed system, you alter the relationships between image and origin." A realization began to form in my mind. "You mean," I said slowly, "someone is controlling what is reflected and how?" Holmes nodded. "Yes," he said. "But more importantly, what is not reflected." Linwood looked between us, pale. "I don't understand." Holmes turned toward him. "Then allow me to simplify," he said. He stepped closer to the black frame mirror we had examined earlier. "If I were to isolate a reflection entirely," he said, "to prevent it from synchronizing with its source—" He paused. "What would remain of the person who cast it?" A long silence followed. Then, very faintly, from somewhere within the mirror-lined room, we heard something that made my blood run cold. A knock, not on the door, but from inside the glass. The knock came again, not louder, not more forceful, but unmistakably closer. It was the kind of sound that defies instinct, for instinct insists upon categorizing it as wood, metal, door, intrusion. Yet this sound belonged to none of those familiar certainties. It was as though the house itself had briefly forgotten the proper boundary between inside and outside. Linwood stumbled backward, his face drained of all color. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." Holmes, however, did not move. He stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed upon the black-framed mirror. "Interesting," he said softly. I turned to him sharply. "Holmes, did you hear that?" "I did," he replied. "And you consider it interesting?" "Yes," he said calmly, "because it is intentional." A pause followed in which even the mirrors seemed to hesitate. Then Holmes walked toward the corridor. "Watson," he said, "we are no longer dealing with a passive anomaly or an isolated experiment." He stopped. "We are witnessing continuation." Linwood followed urgently. "Continuation of what?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he began moving briskly through the house, and we had little choice but to follow. As we descended into the lower floor, I noticed something alarming. The mirrors were no longer merely misaligned in reflection. They were beginning to show entirely different states of the same space. In one mirror the drawing room was empty. In another, Holmes still stood in it. In a third I saw Linwood, but he was alone. And in yet another there was nothing at all, not even the room, only darkness. We reached the staircase hall, where the density of mirrors made orientation increasingly difficult. Each step felt like passing through overlapping versions of reality, none of them entirely reliable. Holmes suddenly stopped. "Linwood," he said sharply, "where is the bathroom mirror now?" Linwood blinked. "It this way." He pointed toward the upper corridor. Holmes turned immediately. We rushed upstairs. But as we reached the landing, something was wrong. The door to the bathroom was slightly open. I distinctly remembered closing it. Holmes entered first, and froze. The mirror was gone. The black-frame mirror above the washstand, the source, as Holmes had called it, was no longer there. Only an empty space remained on the wall. Linwood let out a strangled sound. "It was there. I swear it was there." Holmes stepped forward slowly. His eyes narrowed. "No," he said quietly. "It is not gone." He turned his head slightly, scanning the room. "It has been moved." I frowned. "Moved?" Holmes nodded. "And not physically." He walked to the washstand and examined the wall carefully. "The fittings have been altered. The mounting points have been repositioned." He paused. "But not in three-dimensional space." Linwood shook his head desperately. "That doesn't make sense." Holmes turned toward him. "It does," he said. "If the mirror is no longer anchored to a fixed location, then it is no longer bound to a single reflective plane." A silence followed. Then Holmes added quietly, "It is distributed." That word struck me uneasily. "Distributed?" I repeated. Holmes nodded. "Fragmented across multiple surfaces. The system is no longer confined to a single object. It is expanding its domain." He turned toward the corridor. "And that is why we heard the knock." We returned to the lower floor once more, this time with greater urgency. Something had changed in the house during our brief absence. The mirrors no longer reflected consistent geometry. Corridors appeared longer in reflections than in reality. Doors seemed to exist in some mirrors, but not in others. The house was no longer simply unstable. It was multiplying its interpretations of itself. Holmes stopped in the drawing-room. "Watson," he said, "look at Linwood." I did. At first I saw nothing unusual. Then I noticed it. Linwood's reflection in the nearest mirror was no longer perfectly aligned. It was slightly delayed again, but worse. It was not matching his expression. Linwood was frightened, yes, but his reflection appeared curious, as though observing us with detached interest. "Holmes," I said quietly, "it is worsening." "Yes," he replied, "because the system has acquired new input." Linwood turned sharply. "What input?" Holmes looked at him directly. "You arrived here," he said. "A pausa. And you brought attention." Linwood shook his head. "I didn't bring anything. I was invited. I was sold the property." Holmes raised a hand. "Not intentionally," he said. "But causation does not require intent." He walked slowly toward the mirrors. "Consider what has occurred," he said. "A system designed to isolate reflections begins to destabilize upon the introduction of a new subject. That subject experiences progressive separation of identity confirmation." He paused. "And now the system has begun to replicate instability across multiple surfaces." He turned back toward us. "Which means something is learning." A cold silence followed. Then from the corridor outside the drawing-room came another sound. Not a knock this time, a dragging sound, like something being moved slowly across glass. Holmes moved instantly toward the corridor. We followed. What we saw made Linwood cry out. One of the hallway mirrors had begun to behave like a window into another version of the house. Inside it the corridor was identical but darker, and in that reflected corridor something was moving, not clearly visible, not fully formed, but present. Holmes stepped closer, and in the reflection the movement stopped, as though it had noticed him. Holmes spoke softly. "Now we understand the second stage," he said. I swallowed. "Second stage?" He nodded. "The first was separation." He pointed toward the mirror. "The second is observation." Linwood backed away. "Observation of what?" Holmes turned slightly. A pausa. Then he added, "And not just us." The reflected corridor darkened further, and for the first time I saw it clearly. A figure, standing within the mirror, watching back. But it was not Holmes, it was not Linwood, and it was not me. Holmes stared at it for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Dr. Grange is no longer the only one involved." A silence followed so deep that even the house seemed to stop rearranging itself for a moment. Then Holmes turned sharply. "And now," he said, "we must determine what has been added to this system." He stepped forward, and the figure in the mirror stepped forward as well. The figure in the mirror did not move like a man moving toward a glass surface. It moved like something that already knew where the glass would be. Holmes remained perfectly still, his gaze locked upon it. I confess I felt an instinctive urge to step back, yet curiosity, an ever-present companion in my profession, held me rooted. Edward Linwood, however, gave voice to what I could not. "That is not me," he whispered hoarsely. Indeed, it was not. The figure in the reflected corridor was indistinct at first, as though the mirror itself could not decide how much of it should be revealed. Then, gradually, its outline sharpened, shoulders, posture, a faint suggestion of clothing. But the face remained obscured, as though the glass refused to commit to its identity. Holmes spoke at last, quietly. "It is not meant to be you," he said. Linwood blinked. "Then what is it?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the mirror, studying the figure with the same calm intensity he might have applied to a chemical experiment. "Watson," he said at last, "what do you see?" "I see a man," I replied cautiously, "standing in a corridor that mirrors this one." "And is it identical?" At first nothing unusual occurred. Lord Pembroke confirmed the position of the table. Sir Alden Grey acknowledged the placement of documents. Mallory hesitated but agreed with visible reluctance. Then Caldwell spoke. "I do not remember it like this," he said. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Do not remember," Holmes repeated, "or do not recognize." Caldwell frowned. "I—" A silence followed. Holmes stepped forward slightly. "Continue," he said. "What happened next disturbed me deeply." As each man attempted to reconcile memory with observation, contradictions emerged not in detail but in order. The same event was placed at different points in sequence depending on the observer. Mallory insisted Sir Reginald spoke before touching the candle. Sir Alden Grey insisted the candle was already dimming before speech ceased. Lord Pembroke could not determine whether the four preceded or followed silence. And Caldwell stopped entirely. "I cannot proceed," he said suddenly. Holmes turned toward him. "Why?" Caldwell shook his head. "Because it changes each time I attempt it?" A silence followed. Lestrade frowned. "That's nonsense," he said sharply. "You're imagining it." Holmes raised a hand slightly. "No," he said quietly. "He is experiencing instability under constraint." He turned to us. "Which means the phenomenon is not passive. A pause. It reacts." At this, Holmes walked slowly toward the center of the room. "The question," he said quietly, "is no longer what happened in this room." He looked at each of them in turn. "But what prevents it from being consistently remembered?" A silence followed. Then Holmes spoke again. "And more importantly," he paused, "what benefits from that prevention?" It was then that I noticed something I had not previously observed. Sir Alden Grey was watching Holmes with increasing unease. Not fear, recognition. Holmes noticed it too. He stepped closer. "You have realized something," Holmes said quietly. Sir Alden hesitated. He began. Holmes did not press. Instead, he said softly, "Tell me." A long pause followed. Then Sir Alden Grey spoke. "It is not the candle," he said quietly. Holmes did not move. Sir Alden Grey swallowed. "It is what the candle represents," he said. A silence fell. Lestrade frowned. "Meaning what?" Sir Alden. Grey shook his head slightly. "I cannot explain it clearly," he said. "But every time we return to it, everything else becomes uncertain again." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And before we returned?" Sir Alden Grey hesitated. "Before," he said slowly, "we were certain." A heavy silence followed. Holmes turned away slowly. And for the first time since this affair began, I saw something in his expression that I did not recognize immediately. Not confusion, not doubt, but calculation under constraint. He spoke quietly. "Watson," he said. "Yes, we are approaching the limit of what can be reconstructed." I frowned. "What does that mean?" Holmes looked at the table. "It means," he said softly, "that someone has designed this case so that every attempt to stabilize it produces further instability." He paused. "And that design is not accidental." Outside, the fog thickened against the windows once more. And as I watched Holmes stand in the dim light of the study, I realized with growing unease that we were no longer reconstructing a crime. We were attempting to reconstruct something that actively resisted being known at all. I have often believed that a case reaches its most dangerous point not when the criminal is near discovery, but when the investigator begins to doubt whether the very structure of the investigation is sound. It is a subtle shift, almost imperceptible at first, yet it alters everything that follows. We had reached such a point. The reconstruction at Lord Pembroke's residence had ended not in resolution, but in a kind of intellectual vertigo. Each witness had departed more unsettled than before, and even Lestrade, though unwilling to concede anything, had become noticeably quieter in his objections. Holmes, however, appeared to have withdrawn further into himself. We returned to Baker Street in silence. The fog outside was now so dense that the cab lamps seemed to strike only walls of grey rather than air. It felt, I recall, as though London itself had become less a city and more a closed chamber. Once inside our rooms, Holmes remained standing for several minutes without speaking. Then, at last, he moved toward the fireplace and addressed me in a low voice. "Watson," he said. "Yes, Holmes? We have reached a point of structural failure." I frowned slightly. "In what sense?" Holmes turned toward me. "In the sense that every attempt to stabilize the sequence produces further distortion." He paused. "That is not normal cognitive error." I studied him carefully. "What do you believe is happening, then?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he crossed to the table where the wax fragments still lay arranged in careful order. "I believe," he said slowly, "that we are dealing with an influence that operates at the level of sequencing." I hesitated. "Sequencing?" "Yes," Holmes replied. "The order in which events are anchored in perception." He tapped the table once. "Not the events themselves." A silence followed. I confess I found this idea difficult to accept. "You are suggesting," I said carefully, "that something is altering how events are remembered in order rather than content?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely." I shook my head slightly. "But that would imply a level of control over human cognition." Holmes interrupted gently. "Not control," he said. "Interference." He paused, subtle, selective, and inconsistent. He walked slowly toward the window. "And more importantly, self-correcting." I frowned. "What do you mean by that?" Holmes looked out into the fog. "Every time we attempt to fix the sequence," he said quietly, "it shifts again." He turned slightly. "Not randomly. A pause, but adaptively." At this point I felt a faint unease settle more firmly within me. "Holmes," I said, "this begins to sound less like a criminal case and more like something psychological." Holmes nodded. "That is one interpretation." He returned to the table. "But it fails to account for physical consistency." He pointed to the wax fragments. "The candle remains the only invariant." He paused. "And yet it is also the most disputed." A silence followed. It was then that Holmes made an unexpected decision. "We must return once more," he said. I frowned. "To Kensington again?" "Yes," he replied, "but not to reconstruct." He looked at me directly. "To isolate." I did not understand. "Isolate what?" Holmes's expression remained steady. "The moment of divergence." We arrived at Lord Pembroke's residence for the third time shortly after dusk. The fog had thickened into something almost oppressive, swallowing sound as much as light. The house itself seemed quieter than before, as though it too had begun to withdraw from the case. This time Holmes refused to allow any discussion before entering the study. "All witnesses will remain silent unless spoken to," he instructed. Lestrade objected immediately. "This is unnecessary theatre." Holmes did not respond. He entered the study first. We followed. The room was unchanged, yet it felt different, not physically but in atmosphere. There was a stillness that suggested anticipation rather than emptiness. Holmes walked directly to the table. Then he did something unexpected. He removed the candle from its holder. Lestrade immediately stepped forward. "What are you doing?" Holmes held up a hand. "Observe," he said quietly. He placed the candle at the center of the table. Then he spoke. "This is the reference point." A pause. He turned to the witnesses. "Do not speak. Do not interpret. Only observe." Silence fell. Holmes struck a match. The flame illuminated the room briefly. He brought it to the wick. The candle ignited. For several seconds nothing happened. Then Holmes extinguished the match, and in that moment something occurred that I struggle even now to describe with precision. Not an event, not an action, but a disruption in consistency. Sir Alden Grey blinked sharply. Mallory shifted as though uncertain of his footing. Caldwell frowned deeply. Lord Pembroke stepped back. Lestrade narrowed his eyes, and Holmes remained perfectly still. "Now," Holmes said quietly, "describe what you saw." A pause followed. Sir Alden spoke first. "The candle lit normally," he said. Mallory nodded. "Yes." Caldwell hesitated. "I think so," he said uncertainly. Lord Pembroke frowned. "I am not certain," he said. "It seemed—" Lestrade gave a short laugh. "This is absurd." Holmes did not look at him. Instead he spoke again. "Describe the extinguishing." A silence followed. Sir Alden frowned. "It was immediate," he said. Mallory shook his head. "No." Caldwell looked distressed. "I do not remember it clearly." Lord Pembroke hesitated. "I cannot fix the moment," he admitted. A silence fell. At that moment Holmes stepped forward. "Stop," he said quietly. Silence returned instantly. He turned to me. "Watson," he said softly. "Yes?" "Do you notice the pattern?" I frowned. "Yes," I said slowly. "The timing is inconsistent again." Holmes nodded. He looked at the candle, but not randomly. He paused. "Each witness has shifted toward a different version of the same instability." Lestrade frowned. "What does that prove?" Holmes turned toward him. "It proves," he said quietly, "that the instability is not shared. A silence followed. He extinguished the candle again, this time deliberately. The room fell into darkness for a brief moment before the lamps were relit. Holmes spoke softly. "Observe now." A pause. "Has anything changed?" The witnesses hesitated. Sir Alden frowned. Mallory shook his head. "I feel uncertain," Caldwell whispered. "I cannot place the moment." Lord Pembroke said nothing. Lestrade stepped back slightly. "This is nonsense," he muttered again, but less firmly this time. Holmes turned slowly, and for the first time since I have known him, I saw something close to uncertainty in his expression. Not emotional doubt, but structural reassessment. He spoke quietly. "It is not the candle," he said. A pause. "It never was." I felt a chill at his words. "What then?" I asked. Holmes looked at the group. "It is the moment around the candle." A silence followed. He continued. "The transition point between certainty and uncertainty." He paused. "And that," he said softly, "is being manipulated." Outside, the fog pressed harder against the windows, and in that dim, oppressive study I realized something most unsettling of all. We were no longer trying to identify a murderer. We were trying to identify the point at which reality itself stopped agreeing with itself. I have often thought that the most unsettling discoveries in life are not those which contradict reason, but those which expand its boundaries until it no longer feels familiar. It was in such a state that I found myself as we left Lord Pembroke's residence after Holmes's final demonstration in the study. The fog had grown heavier still, so dense that the gas lamps along the street appeared to float within it rather than pierce it. London in that moment seemed less a place of living movement and more a suspended thought, unfinished, uncertain. Holmes did not speak until we had returned to Baker Street. Even then he stood for a long time in silence, coat still on, hat untouched, as though he were waiting for some internal mechanism to complete its calculation. At last he said quietly, "Watson." "Yes, Holmes?" "We have reached the outer boundary of the phenomenon." I frowned slightly. "The boundary?" "Yes," he replied. "Where observation ceases to produce stable inference." He walked slowly toward the fireplace. "And where inference itself becomes unreliable." I studied him carefully. "You are saying the case cannot be solved by conventional reasoning?" Holmes shook his head. "No," he said. "I am saying conventional reasoning is being interrupted." A pause followed. "That is different," I said slowly. "Yes," Holmes agreed. "And far more significant." He sat down, leaning forward slightly, elbows on knees. "Watson," he said, "tell me what you recall most clearly about the candle." I hesitated. "It was central to the death of Sir Reginald Crowther," I said. Holmes nodded. "And its extinguishing marked the moment of death." "Yes," I replied. Holmes looked at me steadily. "And are you certain of the order?" I opened my mouth, then stopped. For the first time I realized I was not. "I believe so," I said cautiously. Holmes nodded once. "That is the problem." A silence settled between us. Outside, a carriage passed faintly in the fog below, its sound muted as though distance itself had been softened. Holmes rose again. "We must consider the possibility," he said quietly, "that the candle is not the object of interest." I frowned. "But you said it was the only invariant." "Yes," Holmes replied, "because it was the only thing everyone agreed upon." He paused. "And that makes it the ideal point of manipulation." I felt a faint unease. "Manipulation by whom?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead he walked to the window and looked out into the fog. "That," he said at last, "is what we must now determine." There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered almost immediately, visibly anxious. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "there is someone downstairs." Holmes turned sharply. "She refused to give her name," she replied. "A lady. She insists she must speak to you about the candle." A silence followed. Holmes's expression changed subtly. Not surprise. Recognition of an unexpected variable. "Bring her up," he said at once. She entered moments later. I shall not easily forget the impression she made. She was dressed in dark traveling clothes, modest yet carefully arranged, and though her face was partially obscured by a veil, her presence carried a quiet steadiness that contrasted sharply with the instability we had witnessed in every other participant of this case. When she spoke, her voice was controlled. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said. Holmes inclined his head. "Madam." She hesitated only briefly. "I am Miss Eleanor Vane," she said. At the mention of her name, Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. I sensed immediately that this was not an unfamiliar name to him. "You were present at the meeting," Holmes said. "Yes," she replied. A silence followed. "And yet," Holmes continued, "you were not listed among the witnesses." "I was not meant to be," she said calmly. That statement alone altered the atmosphere of the room. Lestrade, who had arrived moments earlier and now stood in the doorway, frowned. "Meaning what?" he demanded. Miss Vane turned slightly toward him. "I was observing," she said. Holmes stepped forward slightly. "From where?" She hesitated. "From the adjoining study." A silence followed. I glanced at Holmes. He did not appear surprised, only attentive. "You saw Sir Reginald Crowther die?" Holmes asked. "Yes," she said. "And the candle?" She hesitated again. "I saw it," she said slowly, "but I am not certain what I saw." Holmes's eyes sharpened. She took a slow breath. "I saw the flame," she said carefully, "but I cannot recall when it changed." A pause. Only that it did not feel sudden. A silence followed. Lestrade gave an irritated sound. "This is the same nonsense we've heard all week." Holmes raised a hand. "No," he said quietly. He turned to her. "Miss Vane," he said, "were you approached after the incident?" She hesitated. A pause. "By whom?" Holmes asked. She shook her head slightly. "I do not know," she said. "Only that I was asked what I remembered about the timing." Holmes stepped closer. "And after that?" Her expression tightened slightly. "My certainty weakened," she admitted. A silence followed. Holmes turned away slowly, and I saw in that moment something shift in his understanding. Not resolution, but alignment. He spoke quietly. "Watson," he said. "Yes?" "We now have confirmation of something we could not previously isolate." I frowned. "And what is that?" Holmes looked at the group. "That the instability is not limited to those directly present at the death." A pause. "It extends to observers." Lestrade frowned. "That proves nothing except suggestion spreading through conversation." Holmes shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "It spreads selectively." He turned toward Miss Vane. "Miss Vane," he said gently, "when did your certainty begin to fail?" She hesitated. "After I was asked," she said. Holmes nodded. "And before that?" "I was certain," she admitted. A silence followed. Holmes turned back toward us. "Do you see?" he said quietly. "No," I said honestly. Holmes's expression darkened slightly. "Then I shall be more explicit," he said. He stepped forward. "Someone is not merely altering testimony after the fact." A pause. "They are shaping the point at which certainty collapses." A silence followed. At that moment Holmes walked to the center of the room. "We are no longer dealing with a murder investigation," he said quietly. He looked at each of us in turn. "We are dealing with a controlled breakdown of sequence perception." A pause. "And the candle is the trigger reference." Lestrade frowned. "Trigger for what?" Holmes looked at him steadily. "For the moment," he said quietly, "when observation stops agreeing with itself." A long silence followed. Outside, the fog pressed against Baker Street like a living wall. And for the first time since the case began, I realized with growing unease that Holmes was no longer merely analyzing the mystery. He was beginning to anticipate the moment when the mystery would no longer behave like one. There are conclusions in science which arrive with the force of revelation, yet feel strangely like recollection, an impression that one has not discovered something new, but rather remembered something that had been deliberately obscured. It was in such a manner that Sherlock Holmes, standing in our Baker Street rooms on that fog-laden night, approached the final truth of the matter. Miss Eleanor Vane had departed only moments earlier, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than her presence. Lestrade had followed soon after, muttering about nervous impressions and mass suggestion, though even he did not seem entirely convinced of his own dismissal. Only Holmes remained fully composed, and yet I had known him long enough to recognize when composure was not certainty, but control over uncertainty. He stood by the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed not upon the room but upon something beyond it. "Watson," he said quietly. "Yes, Holmes? I believe I now understand the structure of the case." I looked at him carefully. "And what structure is that?" Holmes turned slowly. "A staged collapse of temporal agreement," he said. A pause followed. "But not through deception of facts." He stepped forward. "Through manipulation of reference points." I frowned slightly. "You mean the candle?" Holmes nodded. He walked to the table where the wax fragments still lay arranged with his usual precision. "But not the candle as an object," he added quietly. He tapped the table. "The candle is a shared anchor of perception." A silence followed. Holmes continued. "In every account," he said, "the witnesses disagree on sequence, but not on importance." He raised his gaze. "They all remember that the candle mattered." I felt a faint unease. "Yes," I said slowly, "because it was present at the death." Holmes nodded. "Precisely." He paused. "And that makes it ideal." I studied him. "Ideal for what?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the window, gazing into the fog outside. "For displacement," he said at last. A silence followed. I frowned. "Displacement of what?" Holmes turned slightly. "Of certainty itself." He walked back toward the center of the room. "Watson," he said quietly, "consider what has occurred." He raised one finger. "A man dies in a locked room." Second finger. "A candle is present at the moment of death." Third finger. "Every witness recalls the candle but cannot agree on its timing." He lowered his hand. "And then each witness becomes increasingly uncertain the more they are questioned." A pause. "What does that suggest?" I hesitated. "Psychological suggestion?" I offered. Holmes shook his head. "No." He stepped closer. "It suggests interference at the level of event anchoring." There was a long silence. Then Holmes did something I did not expect. He extinguished every lamp in the room. Darkness fell immediately, broken only by the faint glow of street fog filtering through the window. "Holmes," I began. "Observe," he said quietly. Then he struck a match. The flame flared briefly, illuminating his face in sharp contrast. He brought it to the candle. The wick ignited. For a moment everything was still. Then Holmes extinguished the match, and spoke. "Now," he said softly, "what do you remember?" I hesitated. "The candle lit," I said. Holmes nodded. "And when did it go out?" I frowned. "When you extinguished it." He shook his head slightly. "Are you certain of that?" I hesitated. Something in the question unsettled me. "I believe so," I said slowly. Holmes turned toward me. "Or," he said quietly, "is that simply the most coherent version your mind has assembled?" A silence followed. At that moment Miss Vane's voice echoed in my memory. I saw it, but I cannot recall when it changed. Then Mallory. I cannot fix the moment. Then Caldwell. It changes each time I attempt it. Holmes spoke again. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you understand what happens when a group of observers cannot agree on sequence?" I hesitated. "They become uncertain?" Holmes nodded. He stepped forward. "And when uncertainty spreads to the same reference point repeatedly," he paused, "reality becomes non-fixed in perception." A silence followed. Lestrade's earlier objections now felt distant, almost irrelevant. Holmes continued. "The candle was never the anomaly," he said. A pause. "It was the stabilizer." He looked at me directly. "And someone ensured that stabilizer could not remain fixed." I frowned. "But why?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward the table again. "Because," he said quietly, "once the stabilizer is removed," he paused, "all remaining events become movable." A silence followed. Then, for the first time since the case began, Holmes spoke without hesitation. "The murder of Sir Reginald Crowther was not the objective," he said. I froze slightly. "What then?" I asked. Holmes turned slowly. "The objective," he said quietly, "was to create a condition in which no single version of that murder could remain stable." A pause. "And in doing so," he looked toward the candle, "the truth itself becomes unanchored." A long silence followed. Outside, the fog thickened once more against Baker Street's windows, and in that dim, wavering light Holmes finally spoke the conclusion I had not yet dared to articulate. "The candle that went out alone," he said quietly, "was never extinguished by flame." A pause. "It was extinguished by disagreement." He turned toward me. "And that," he added softly, "is the most dangerous kind of crime there is, for it does not destroy life, it destroys certainty about life." And in that moment I understood at last why this case had resisted every attempt at resolution. Because we had not been investigating a death, we had been investigating the deliberate unmaking of agreement itself.